The General Assembly Partition Resolution, 29th November 1947. On the 26th of September, Creech-Jones announced at the UN General Assembly, sitting as the ad hoc Committee on Palestine, that Britain planned an early withdrawal. Over the next 2 months, on the basis of the UNSCOP recommendations, 3 specially appointed subcommittees of the ad hoc committee hammered out the terms of the resolution to be submitted to the General Assembly. All sides mounted intensive lobbying campaigns. The atmosphere was overheated. The whole of New York was, of course, mad, so vast, so dirty, so crushing to the individual, one Jewish agency emissary reported. More to the point, for Walter Aten, who had studied the map of the United Nations very, very thoroughly, and now orchestrated the Zionist contacts at Lake Success, where the General Assembly was meeting, where the activities of the hostile British delegation, held to be the ablest of all the delegations in the international body. Moreover, Aten was concerned about his own staff of Jewish Agency Political Department, diplomats, and the attached American Zionist officials, who, he said, were motivated by a hunt after kavod, glory, honor, ambitions, considerations of prestige, etc., all playing the major part in people's lives and minds. The number of Toshlecker, ass lickers, surrounding Wiseman at present makes me sick. Nonetheless, the Zionists efficiently deployed their manpower, assigning an official with the appropriate language and diplomatic skill to work on each UN delegation. Eliyahu Elias Sasson, the Aleppo-born Arabist, making contacts with the Syrians, the Yemenis, and the Iraqis, Moshe Tov, working with the Colombians, Ecuadorians, and Mexicans, the Russian-born Eliyahu Epstein, handling the Soviets, and the South African-born Michael Comey, dealing with the South Africans, New Zealanders, and Australians. But there were ruffled feathers among officials assigned minor countries, such as Luxembourg, Ethiopia, and Liberia. They were too foolish to realize that each of these countries has exactly as much of a vote as others with more important sounding names. The Zionists suffer from violent mood swings. In late September, it was pessimism. A fortnight later, they were buoyed by the American reiteration, on the 11th of October, of support for the majority recommendations, despite a last-ditch struggle against partition by the State Department. The Soviet Union followed suit 2 days later. We are not dissatisfied with the results achieved so far, reported Aten. But he realistically cautioned, I realize that there is many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and we shall not start cheering until the whistle blows. On the 13th of November, Britain announced that it would withdraw all its troops from Palestine by the 1st of August, 1948. It was Subcommittee 1 that translated the UNSCOP majority recommendations into the proposals that were approved by the General Assembly as Resolution 181 on the 29th of November 1947. The prospective minorities in each state posed a major problem. The Zionists feared that the Arab minority would prefer, rather than move to the Arab state, to accept the citizenship of the Jewish state, and we are interested in less Arabs who will be citizens of the Jewish state, said Golda Meir in brackets, acting head of the Jewish Agency Political Department. Yitzhak Gruenbaum, a member of the Jewish Agency Executive and head of its labor department, thought that Arabs who remained in the Jewish state but were citizens of the Arab state would constitute a permanent irredenta. Ben-Gurion thought that the Arabs remaining in the Jewish state, whether citizens of the Arab or Jewish state, would constitute an irredenta, and in the event of war, they would become a fifth column. If they are citizens of the Arab state, argued Ben-Gurion, we would be able to expel them. But if they were citizens of the Jewish state, we will be able only to jail them. And it is better to expel them than jail them. So it was better not to facilitate their receipt of Jewish state citizenship. But Ben-Gurion feared that they would prefer the citizenship. Eliezer Kaplan, the Jewish Agency's treasurer, added, "Our young state will not be able to stand such a large number of strangers in its midst." Much of the lobbying and diplomacy surrounding Subcommittee 1 focused on the exact contours of the two states. In the end, Britain and the Arabs, assisted by the U.S. State Department, managed to persuade the ad hoc committee to reduce the size of the UNSCOP proposed Jewish state. The British and the State Department made vigorous efforts to consign the Negev, which the UNSCOP majority had earmarked for the Jews, to Arab sovereignty. The personal intervention of Weizmann with Truman on the 19th of November was required, as well perhaps as Truman's perception that the Negev represented for the Jews what the frontier had represented for the Americans a century before, to save the bulk of the desert for the Jews, though they had to give up Beersheba and a strip of territory along the Sinai Negev border. In addition, Jaffa was removed from the prospective Jewish state and awarded to the Arabs as a sovereign enclave. The Jews were compensated with additional territory in the Galilee. With these changes to the original UNSCOP majority plan, the prospective Jewish state was reduced to 55% of Palestine, with a population of some 500,000 Jews and an Arab minority of around 450,000. Another 100,000 or so Jews lived in Jerusalem, which was to be part of the international zone. On the 26th of October, Zionist officials assessed that there were 23 votes for partition and 13 against. Matters slightly improved by 25th of November when Subcommittee 1's report was finally adopted by the ad hoc committee. The vote was 25 for, 13 against, and 17 abstentions. This was still short of the necessary 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. The numbers triggered alarm bells in Jerusalem, and the Jewish Agency Political Department, assisted by local branches of the World Zionist Organization, embarked on a world-embracing campaign to bring in the votes. The campaign proceeded along the two tracks: direct Zionist lobbying to persuade individual governments and indirect efforts to persuade Washington to pressure other governments to vote for partition. Both campaigns moved into high gear on the 24th and 25th of November. On the 23rd of November, Jamal Husseini, the AHC representative, was optimistic, though another member of the Palestinian delegation, Wasif Kamal, seemed less so when he said, "The Jews are the most cunning people among the nations of the world, and on top of that they have the means. They bribe most of the delegates, but we do not have the money to bribe." The British estimated that there were 27 votes for partition and 14 or 15 against it. On the 26th of November, their estimate was 30 for partition and 15 against. But this excluded the Siamese delegation, which was disappeared, or the Liberian, which may possibly cast its vote with the Arabs. It was touch and go. Direct Zionist lobbying focused both on the governments at home and the delegations in New York, and the range of arguments, incentives, and disincentives were brought to bear. The underlying argument was the 2,000-year history of Jewish suffering and statelessness, culminating in the Holocaust, and the international community's responsibility to make amends. The Zionists faced a major challenge in the 20-member Latin American bloc. The United Nations' largest were the anti-Zionist influences of the Catholic Church. The Vatican opposed partition and Jewish statehood, and local Arab and German communities were strong and were anti-American feeling, which affected attitudes to Zionism, was widespread through the regimes themselves were dependent on and aligned with Washington. During April, May, the Latin Americans appeared to support the Zionist cause, or so it seemed to Jewish agency officials. But by October, many were wavering or even antagonistic, due, the Zionists believed, to a very intensive campaign by the Arabs and their friends of commercial pressure, diplomatic pressure, bribery, and to apparent U.S. irresolution of the bloc. Only 5 or 6 were definitely for partition, and 2, Argentina and Cuba, were committed on the Arab side. Of the remaining 13, about half were leaning toward partition, and the rest were inclined to abstain. In the ad hoc committee vote of the 25th of November 6th, Latin America countries abstained. Paraguay absented itself, and 1, Cuba, voted against 12 ayes. In the following days, the Zionists directed their efforts towards the recalcitrant countries. UN representatives, who seem largely to have been left to their own devices on the Palestine question. Pecuniary considerations apparently affected the votes of 1 or 2 Latin American ambassadors, though documentation in this regard is hard to find. According to reports, 1 Latin American delegation voted for partition after receiving $75,000. Another, perhaps Costa Rica, turned down a $45,000 bribe, but nonetheless voted for partition. More telling, apparently, were promises and threats directed at individual governments by American Jewish businessmen and politicians. Apparently prominent in this lobbying effort was Samuel Zemurray, head of the United Fruit Corporation, which had large plantations in the Caribbean. One of the most vocal pro-Zionist ambassadors to the United Nations was Jorge Garcia Granados, the Guatemalan. He had led the pro-partition camp in UNSCOP, and during the General Assembly meeting had lobbied his fellow Latin Americans relentlessly. The British believed that he was receiving money from American Jewish organizations, and alleged that he was living extravagantly at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. American diplomats had reported that Granados enjoyed a beautiful friendship with a Jewish named Emma. Perhaps these reports were true, but he also, as he put it in his memoirs, believed in the justice and historic necessity of the creation of a Jewish state. The black African vote, Ethiopia, and Liberia was also important. Zionist officials in Britain approached Lorna Wingate, the widow of Orde Wingate. During the late 1930s, Orde Wingate was a passionate philo-Zionist, and as a young British Army captain, trained and led Haganah troops in counter-insurgency operations during the Arab Revolt in Palestine. He died in an air crash in Burma in 1944 while commanding the Chindit guerrillas against the Japanese. In 1940 to 1941, he had led British forces that reconquered Abyssinia from the Italians and restored Ethiopian independence and the rule of Emperor Haile Selassie. The emperor owed Wingate, and in November 1947, the Zionists decided to call in the debt. Lorna Wingate cabled Selassie, "Fate of the world may well hang on United Nations Palestine decision. Partition only hope of ultimate peace. I cast myself before you in name of Orde Wingate to ask that you stand again in history as a man of God and man of destiny." In the end, Ethiopia abstained. Apparently Arab threats concerning the well-being of Egypt's large Coptic minority carried the day. By contrast, Liberia was subjected to the stick. Both former U.S. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, who headed an American Liberian development company, and Harvey Firestone, whose Firestone Rubber Company owned plantations in Liberia and imported rubber, Liberia's main or only export, were mobilized to threaten a boycott unless Liberia voted for partition. Jan Smuts, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of South Africa, was also recruited to pressure Monrovia. Liberia duly switched from abstention to aye. India, represented on UNSCOP, was vigorously lobbied from summer 1947, even though its pro-Arab stance was stark and consistent. Even Albert Einstein was mobilized. Chaim Greenberg, a member of the American section of the JAE and a man of letters, approached the physicist and then drafted Einstein's letter to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Einstein brandished morality rather than political interest or legalisms. The Jews, he wrote, had been history's victims for centuries. Now the United Nations was considering compensating this pariah nation. The Holocaust only underlined the urgent need for a sovereign Jewish state, and this would not infringe on the rights of others, because the Jews would bring material benefit to their Arab neighbors, as they had in the past. In the event the Arabs held sway or were assured sovereignty in over 99% of the areas liberated from the Turks in World War I, it was only moral that the Jews received the remaining sliver of land in which they had once been sovereign, as Nehru well knew. Nehru, in his years in a British prison, had written a history of the world. In the august scale of justice, which weighs need against need, there is no doubt as to whose need is more heavy, wrote Einstein. Nehru responded with both realpolitik and ethics. He asserted that in India there was the deepest sympathy for the great suffering of the Jewish people. But the national policies are unfortunately essentially selfish policies. Each country thinks of its own interest first, and India's interest, he implied, necessitated siding with the Arabs. But he added that in Palestine the conflict was between two sets of rights, and he was not convinced that Jewish aspirations could be fulfilled without impinging on Arab rights. He declined to embrace Jewish statehood. During September-November, Zionist officials repeatedly met Indian diplomats and journalists at the United Nations. They were still eager to convert the giant of the subcontinent. Vijayalakshmi, Pandit Nehru's sister, who headed the delegation, occasionally threw out hints that something might change, but Shertok was brought down to earth by historian Kavalim Panikar, another member of the Indian delegation. It is idle for you to try to convince us that the Jews have a case. We know it. But the point is simply this. For us to vote for the Jews means to vote against the Muslims. This is a conflict in which Islam is involved. We have 13 million Sikh Muslims in our midst. Therefore, we cannot do it. In a sign of the panic that overtook the Zionist leadership at the 11th hour, one further effort was made to convert India. On the 27th of November, Weizmann cabled Nehru that rejection of partition would spur the Palestinians to war. I cannot understand how India can wish to obstruct such a fair two-state settlement, he argued, but India would not budge. China was also wooed, and perhaps Zionist lobbying contributed to the shift from outright rejection of partition to what Silver called benevolent neutrality. In the end, China abstained. The Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, V.K. Wellington Koo, though sympathetic to Zionism, explained, China has her own difficulties. The Chinese Republic has 20 million Muslims, many of whose leaders hold important positions in Nanking and throughout China. Nor through most of October to November was Western Europe, from the Zionist viewpoint, in the bag. Our last hope is France, said Jamal Husseini, the AHC representative in New York, a few days before the crucial vote. France was to remain a major Zionist headache until the last minute, and its vote, it was understood, would influence that of Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Denmark. France had to take account of its traditional alliance with Britain, and the 16 million Muslims under its rule in North Africa. And the winds from the Vatican affected French thinking. Initial French utterances did not bode well. True, France had helped the Zionists in the Exodus affair, but Paul Ramadier, the French Prime Minister, told Zionist officials who came to lobby him in August that Britain was in serious difficulties and that the Arab League was a force to be reckoned with, and France could not ignore the Arab population within the French Union. He wondered whether some interim arrangement might not be made. After all, there were two ways of getting the Jews to Palestine, the way of Moses and the way of Esther, to which Beryl Locker, the chief Zionist interlocutor, replied that as far as he knew, Esther did not lead the Jews to Palestine. Perhaps a suitable country would be found for Europe's Jewish DPs within the French Union, Remader suggested. Wiseman gave the French UN delegation a persuasive pep talk in New York on the 25th of September, but pro-Arab French officials and a stream of anti-partition cables from the French consulate in Jerusalem and the French legation in Damascus dampened its effect, and in any case, the matter was to be decided in the French cabinet. By October, France's position had crystallized into abstention. One Zionist official reported from Paris that the chances of changing the position of the French Foreign Ministry were very slim. But the key lay with the cabinet. The Zionists, spearheaded by Wiseman, mobilized Leon Blum, the former prime minister and elder statesman of French socialism, to lobby the government. The fall of the socialist-led Remadier administration and its replacement on the 19th November by one led by Robert Schuman with socialist minority only aggravated matters. France abstained on the 25th of November in the ad hoc committee. But intense Zionist lobbying and pangs of Holocaust-related conscience at last persuaded the cabinet the following day to instruct Alexandre Parodi, the head of the French UN delegation, to vote aye. According to British diplomats, it was the threat of resignation by 3 members of the cabinet, Financier Minister René Mayer, Labour Minister Daniel Mayer, and Interior Minister Jules Moch, buttressed by their announcement that American Jewry would organize a congressional campaign against continued U.S. economic aid to France should it abstain, that clinched the decision, causing consternation in the Quai d'Orsay and prompting Parodi to ask the General Assembly on the 28th of November for a 24-hour delay in the voting, a hiatus in which he sought and failed to get the instructions reversed. The delay, which caused palpitations among the Zionists, who feared that the 2/3 majority they believed they had in hand would slip away, was misinterpreted by them by stemming from machinations initiated by Harold Beeley and the Arab camp. Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg also caused the Zionists unease until they voted aye. From September through November, they had adopted the attitude that they would vote for partition only if America, England, and France would vote for it. Less than 2 weeks before the vote, the Luxembourg delegate said that his government had given him complete freedom of action and that he intended to vote against partition. The Arabs had persuaded him that partition would lead to the outbreak of war. The Belgian government, with Paul Henry SPAC, at its head, generally favored partition. Or so SPAC told Zionist officials. But he was under strong pressure in the contrary direction from his UN delegation and from the country's Catholic Party. As well, there were fears for the future of Belgian commercial interest in Arab countries, especially Egypt, and a desire not to offend Britain. But SPAC seems to have cut his sail according to each interlocutor. On the 26th of November, he told the British ambassador, George Rendell, that he was unhappy with partition, which would lead to war. Moreover, he disapproved of the American and Soviet position in favor of partition, coupled with an unwillingness to provide forces to implement it. And yet, that was the only ballgame in town, so how could Belgium abstain? He asked Rendell for advice, and the ambassador, purely personally, recommended abstention. More formally, London declined to offer advice and added high-mindedly that it deprecated attempts by any power to influence others. Holland referred to the problem posed by her Muslim population of 16 million in Indonesia, but assured the Zionists that it would stick to its UNSCOP representatives' pro-partition position. Speaking of all three Benelux countries, a Zionist diplomat concluded after the vote. Their affirmative vote at the end came with some relief. Britain itself decided to abstain, and indeed, in the final days before the vote instructed its diplomats to refrain from influencing other countries, one way or another. But without doubt, British diplomats around the globe, and especially in New York, privately advised various countries on the best course of action. From the Zionist standpoint, the Anglo-Saxon dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, were an easier sell, and in the event all four voted for partition. But it was not all smooth sailing. Public opinion after the Holocaust strongly supported Jewish statehood, but the governments all had economic and political interests that militated in the opposite direction, and the traditional alignment of their foreign policies with London's seemed to indicate abstention. In June 1947, the Jewish agency's Michael Comey discovered that the New Zealand UN Deputy Head of Delegation, J.S. Reid, was strongly anti-Zionist. Reid left him with the impression that the New Zealand legation is completely under the sway of the British Embassy. Comey was somewhat reassured by the South African minister, H.T. Andrews, who said that although for 90% of the time the Dominion's views roughly coincided with those of Britain, occasionally they took an independent tack that the British would not insist on unanimity in the Palestine vote. London, for its part, was careful not to be seen to be pushing the Dominions. South Africa, with Smuts firmly at the helm, consistently championed the Zionist cause, but Australia and Canada, Australia's UNSCOP representative, had abstained, were not completely firm, and New Zealand, almost down to the wire, caused the Zionists anxiety. Early on, Wellington had assured the Jewish agency that it would vote aye. But then it wavered, abstaining in the ad hoc committee. The alarmed Zionists dispatched a stream of telegrams. Chaim Weizmann and Henry Morgenthau, Jr., former U.S. Secretary of Treasury and head of the United Jewish Appeal, writing to Prime Minister Peter Fraser and his Finance Minister Walter Nash. The New Zealanders responded that in the absence of an adequate mechanism for implementation, the partition resolution would lead only to bloodshed and chaos. But in the end, they too voted for partition. The key, of course, was in Washington. Early on, Zionist officials commented, "Everything depends upon which way they decide to turn it." Or, as AHC Representative Jamal Husseini put it, "America is our greatest enemy." But Washington's behavior until the final 72 hours was never satisfactory, and at times downright disheartening, reported one Zionist official. The Americans had waited weeks before publicly endorsing the UNSCOP majority report, and in the ad hoc subcommittees, where the delegation most insistent on changes to the detriment. At the General Assembly, the American refusal to pressure other countries did us great damage. The climax of this policy of indifference was on the 26th of November, when Greece, the Philippines, and Haiti, all completely dependent on Washington, suddenly came out, one after another, against its declared policy. It was only then, after frantic Jewish lobbying, that Washington exerted itself to rally support, and the situation improved. It was only in the last 48 hours that we really got the full backing of the United States. From September, the Jewish Agency began applying pressure directly and through American Jewish organizations, the prominent public figures, on Washington to firm up its commitment to partition and to persuade its allies to fall into line. The Zionists were fairly certain that Truman and the White House would stay the course, but they worried about the members of the American UN delegation, and even more about certain State Department officials in Washington, men like Loy Henderson, Director of State's Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs, and those behind him are Momzirim, bastards of the First Order. As Dr. Abba Hillel Silver, chairman of the American Zionist Emergency Council, put it, another bête noire was State's Arabist George Wadsworth, a former ambassador to Iraq, our bitterest enemy, a slinky, suave man, as Rose Halpern, a member of the GAE, put it. During September, early October, and despite Secretary of State George C. Marshall's endorsement on the 17th of September of the majority report, Zionist hearts fluttered. With some State Department officials still privately proclaiming opposition to partition, the Americans projected irresolution, certainly in all that related to partition's implementation, and this sowed irresolution among the other delegations. Once Marshall had publicly endorsed partition, the Jewish Agency began pressing Washington to push or at least nudge other countries in the same direction. I am not suggesting that the United States should convert itself into a steamroller and flatten them all out. Chertok told Henderson, but a friendly word spoken in good time by United States representatives can do a great deal and can decide the issue. Chertok gave Henderson a list of Latin American governments he thought the United States should speak to. The United States maintained that it was canvassing discreetly, but was avoiding any semblance of pressure so as not to put up the backs of the other states. Or so Assistant Secretary of State Robert Lovett and Shertock told Shertock. Down to the 25th of November, the Americans declined to twist arms. Part of the explanation is that almost all the relevant State Department officials were either critical of or opposed partition. But it was also a matter of policy. As late as the 24th of November, Truman instructed Lovett not to use threats or improper pressure of any kind on other delegations to vote for the majority report. Some Zionist officials empathized with the American reluctance to twist arms. In private, several Latin American diplomats complained very bitterly of the high-handed and brutal methods used by Americans generally in regimenting the Latin American countries. And American diplomats argued that the U.S. can't say you do this and that, this and this. We are not in a position to say do this. But following the ad hoc committee vote of the 25th of November, the Zionist officials became desperate. Only a direct order from Truman, it was understood, could move the State Department, its officials in Washington and New York, and its diplomats abroad, to exert real pressure. Wiseman, the Zionist big gun, was wheeled out. Twice he cabled Truman that he was beset by grave anxiety lest the partition plan fail. To obtain the two-thirds majority, and he reminded the president of his past assurances that the United States would rally necessary support for UN endorsement partition plan. Specifically, he asked Truman to see what could be done about France, China, Greece, Turkey, India, Siam, Philippines, Liberia, Ethiopia, Mexico, Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, Paraguay, Colombia, El Salvador, Ecuador. Without at least some of these states, the resolution would not pass, he warned. Wiseman also appealed directly to Secretary of State Marshall. Wiseman's intervention was probably a major contributor to the last-minute policy switch in Washington. In addition, the White House and various officials were bombarded with letters, telegrams, and telephone calls from the American public. Truman later recalled that he had never been subjected to as much pressure and propaganda, and as I had in this instance. It had all left him very upset. On the 25th of November, Truman's special assistant, David Niles, instructed the delegation in New York, in Truman's name, to get all the votes they could, that there would be hell to pay if the voting went the wrong way. And Niles and another presidential aide, Special Consul Clark Clifford, appear to have intervened directly with several countries. Particular pressure was put on Haiti and the Philippines, both in the end vote aye, and Greece, which remained a nay. Senators and congressmen also interceded. 28 senators cabled a dozen wobbling governments to vote for partition, copies going simultaneously to the heads of the delegations to the United Nations and their representatives in Washington. Lebanon's delegate, Camille Kamoun, condemned American influence in the General Assembly as a dark and obscure tyranny, and the Arabs were later to denounce the Zionist methods of promising the threat, temptation, and deception in mobilizing the two-thirds majority. Had the vote been taken secretly, as demanded by the Arabs, the Jews, said Iraq's leading politician, Nuri Said, would have won no more than 3 or 4 votes. But the Arabs had failed to understand the tremendous impact of the Holocaust on the international community, and in any event appear to have used the selfsame methods but with poor results. Wasif Kamel, an AHC official, for example, offered one delegate, perhaps the Russian, a huge sum of money to vote for the Arabs. The Russian declined, saying, "You want me to hang myself?" But the Arabs' main tactic amounted to blackmail, was the promise or threat of war should the Assembly endorse partition. As early as mid-August 1947, Fawzi al-Kawachji, soon to be named the head of the Arab League's volunteer army in Palestine, the Arab Liberation Army, ALA, threatened that, should the vote go the wrong way, we will have to initiate total war. We will murder, wreck, and ruin everything standing in our way, be it English, American, or Jewish. It would be a holy war, the Arabs suggested, which might even evolve into World War III. Cables to the effect poured in from Damascus, Beirut, Amman, and Baghdad during the ad hoc committee deliberations, becoming more lurid according to Zionist officials as the General Assembly vote drew lurid according to As the General Assembly vote drew near, the Arab states generally made no bones about their intention to support the Palestinians with men, money, and arms, and sometimes hinted at an eventful invasion by their armies. They also threatened the Western powers, their traditional allies, with an oil embargo and or abandonment and realignment with the Soviet bloc. Zionist officials, aware of the potency of the fear of the outbreak of war, tended during September-November to pooh-pooh these threats. There is a great deal of bluff in it, Chertok told American Zionist leaders. These countries have much more serious worries in their own homes than to start hazardous military operations in Palestine. And the Arabs of Palestine are extremely unwilling to engage in any new adventure. At the end of September, the American Zionist Emergency Council even issued a 4-page memorandum analyzing and discounting the threats. John D. Rockefeller would sooner turn to Stalin to ask for aid in the reduction of his income tax than Ibn Saud and other Arab kings would call for Soviet intervention in the Middle East. An analysis of the military situation will prove that there is no danger of any large-scale Arab attacks upon public order in Palestine. The military potential of the different Arab-speaking states is notoriously weak. Saudi Arabia's troops are picturesque horsemen. It is inconceivable that any of these forces could interfere in Palestine without the consent and active cooperation of Great Britain. Ridiculous is the assumption that an armed conflict between Arabs and Jews would lead to World War III. But in general, until the last 3 days before the vote, Arab diplomats at the United Nations and their governments refused to believe that partition would gain a 2/3 majority and made no concerted effort to mobilize votes. Clear evidence of Arab desperation exists only for 27th to the 29th November. The old Foreign Office Middle East hand Harold Bealey tried to orchestrate a last-minute postponement and compromise, but the AHC declined to consider any concessions after replacing their more moderate spokesmen, such as Henry Catan, Albert Horaney, and Musa al-Alami with hardliners. And the Arab states, given the shortness of time, their varying agendas, the poor communications between New York and their capitals, and fears of being branded soft on Zionism, failed to rally around a unified proposal. The Lebanese delegate, Cameroon, independently put forward a 5-point federal proposal based on the minority report, but won no kudos or agreement from his fellow Arabs. Pakistan's delegate, Foreign Minister Mohammed Zafrullah Khan, who had led the Arab camp in the previous week's deliberations, one of the ablest and most impressive delegates present from any country, according to a Zionist diplomat, made himself scarce during those final days. One last point. Delegates with no firm instructions from their governments were no doubt influenced by the prevalent atmosphere in New York and Flushing Meadow, where the media broadcast that an opponent of partition was an enemy of the American people. At Flushing Meadow, the almost exclusively Zionist audience applauded declarations of support for Zionism. They hissed Arab speakers. They created the atmosphere of a football match with the Arabs as the away team. On the afternoon of the 29th of November, the General Assembly Presidium at last put draft Resolution 181 to the vote. The hall was packed. In alphabetical order, each country was asked yes, no, or abstains. The procedure was broadcast live on radio around the world. When the tally was complete, 33 states had voted yes, 13 no, with 10 abstentions. Partition had narrowly passed with a 2/3 majority. The nays consisted of the Arab and Muslim states. Greece, Cuba, and India, the ayes of the United States, the Dominions, Western Europe, the Soviet bloc, and most of Latin America. Among the abstainers had been Britain, Chile, and China. The Chilean delegate resigned in protest. Resolution 181, second, called for the partition of Palestine into 2 sovereign states, one Jewish, the other Arab. The mandate was to terminate and the British pullout to be completed not later than the 1st of August, 1948. The 2 countries were to be bound in an economic union. The Jewish state, on about 55% of Palestine's territory, was to consist of the bulk of the Negev, the central and northern coastal plain between Rehovot and Haifa, and the Jezreel and Jordan valleys, including the Galilee panhandle. The Arab state, on about 42% of Palestine, was to consist of the northwestern corner of the Negev and the southern coastal plain around Gaza, the hill country of Samaria, and Judea as far south as Beersheba, and central and western Galilee. The Jerusalem area included the city itself, outlying villages, En-Karim and Abu Dis, and Bethlehem was designated a corpus separatum, to be governed by the UN Trusteeship Council. The borders were set out in adjoining maps. The resolution provided for the establishment of a 5-member commission, which, under the guidance of the Secretary Council, would take over the administer the areas progressively evacuated by the British authorities. the British were specifically enjoined not to prevent, obstruct, or delay the Commission's work. The Commission was to delineate and finalize the borders and help in the establishment of the two provisional governments, which would transitionally operate under the Commission's supervision. The Commission was also to oversee elections in the two states. The resolution assured all of access to religious sites and provided for the fair treatment of minorities. The Zionists and their supporters rejoiced. The Arab delegations walked out of the plenum after declaring the resolution invalid. The Arabs failed to understand why the international community was awarding the Jews any part of Palestine. Further, as one Palestinian historian put it, they could not fathom why 37% of the population had been given 55% of the land, of which they owned only 7%. Moreover, the Jews had been given the best agricultural lands, the coastal plain, and Jezreel and Jordan valleys, while the Arabs had received the bare and hilly parts, as one Palestinian politician, Ani Abdi el-Hadi, told a Zionist agent. More generally, the Palestinians failed to see why they should be made to pay for the Holocaust, and they failed to see why it was not fair for the Jews to be a minority in an unitary Palestinian state, while it was fair for almost half of the Palestinian population, the indigenous majority on its own ancestral soil, to be converted overnight into a minority under alien rule. On the 2nd of December, the Ulama, or Council of Doctors of Theology and Sacred Law of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, one of Islam's supreme authorities, proclaimed a worldwide jihad in defense of Arab Palestine. The Arab UN delegates denounced the resolution and declared that any attempt to implement it would lead to war. Bevin described the Arab reactions to the vote as even worse than we had expected. A particular worry of Bevin's was the safety of the hundreds of thousands of Jews scattered around the Arab world, and particularly the 100,000 Jews of Baghdad who were at risk of having their throats cut. Ben-Gurion, too, believed that war would ensue, but still he argued, "I know of no greater achievement by the Jewish people in its long history since it became a people." Though the Arabs could not or refused to see it, Resolution 181, besides geopolitically redesigning a sliver of eastern Mediterranean coastline, was an emphatic ethical statement, one of those crossroads in history where morality and realism come together. Or as one Jewish historian later put it, it was Western civilization's gesture of repentance for the Holocaust, the repayment of a debt owed by those nations that realized that they might have done more to prevent or at least limit the scale of Jewish tragedy during World War II. Viewed in the longer span, the vote represented humanity's amends for 2,000 years of humiliation and persecution, both by the Christian and Islamic worlds. Of the Jews, the world's eternal stateless people, the world's eternal minority. This was the point made by the Jews of Rome when they celebrated the UN decision on the 1st of December beside Titus's arch, the symbol of our destruction 1,877 years ago. The Zionists had managed to obtain an international warrant for a small piece of earth for the Jewish people. It remained to translate the war rant into statehood. When the Arab UN delegates threatened war if partition was endorsed, they knew what they were talking about. In May 1946, a summit of Arab heads of state at Inhas, Egypt, resolved that Palestine must remain Arab and that Zionism constituted a threat not only to Palestine but to the other Arab states and to all the peoples of Islam. The following month, at the Special Arab League meeting at Bludan, Syria, the delegates, alongside a public rejection of the recommendations of the Anglo-American Committee and a demand for the cessation of all Jewish immigration to Palestine, secretly decided to help the Palestinian Arabs with funds, arms, and volunteers should it come to an armed struggle. The League demanded independence for Palestine as a unitary state with an Arab majority and majority rights for the Jews. The AHC went one better and insisted that the proportion of Jews to Arabs in the unitary state should stand at 1:6, meaning that only Jews who lived in Palestine before the British Mandate be eligible for citizenship. At Inkaz and Bludan, as in the get-togethers that were to follow, the Arab leaders were driven by internal and interstate considerations as well as by a genuine concern for the fate of Palestine. All the regimes, none of them elected, suffered from a sense of illegitimacy and hence vulnerability. All the leaders, or almost all, Jordan's Abdullah was the sole exception, lived in perpetual fear of the street, which could be aroused against them by opposition parties, agitators, or fellow leaders, claiming that they were selling out Palestine. As Chertok quoted the Syrian UN delegate, Fariz al-Khoury, as saying, in October 1947, the Arab states know they may be heading for a disaster, but they have no choice. They are committed up to the hilt vis-a-vis their own public. The position of all these governments was very weak. They were all tottering. They were all unpopular. They had no choice but to adopt a firm, unequivocal, uncompromising attitude on Palestine. The interstate feuding was in large measure fueled by expansionist ambitions and real or imagined fears of others. Expansionist ambitions. Throughout his reign, Prince, later King Abdullah, had sought to establish a Greater Syria, compromising today's Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan under his aegis. The heads of the newborn Republic of Syria also hoped to establish a similarly contoured Greater Syria, but ruled from Damascus. The Lebanese Christians lived in perpetual fear of a Muslim. The Lebanese Christians lived in perpetual fear of a Muslim and Syrian takeover, as in fact gradually occurred after summer 1976. Abdullah and the Hashemite royal house of Iraq also harbored a deep-seated grudge and expansionist ambitions vis-a-vis King Ibn Saud, who had supplanted the Hashemites in Hijaz. Moreover, Abdullah often talked of uniting Jordan and Iraq, again under his tutelage. For their part, the Saudis regarded Jordan covetously, as did the Egyptians, Sudan, and occasionally southern Palestine. In general, the post-war Arab Middle East was divided into two loosely aligned and antagonistic blocs, one comprising Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and the other Jordan and Iraq. The internal Arab League arguments during 1946 to 1948 tended to follow this coalition divide. Though on Palestine the lines of demarcation often blurred with Iraq and Syria, usually taking a harder tack, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia pressing for caution. All the Arab leaders distrusted, and in some cases, notably King Abdullah, hated AHC leader Hajj Amin al-Husseini and opposed the establishment of an al-Husseini-led Palestinian Arab state. Al-Husseini was seen as an inveterate liar and schemer. The Mufti, for his part, reciprocated Abdullah's feelings and distrusted the other Arab leaders, suspecting them of seeking to partition Palestine among themselves. With the approach of the UN General Assembly deliberations in autumn 1947, Arab thinking grew more focused and military. The League's political committee met in Sofar, Lebanon, on the 16th to 19th September and urged the Palestine Arabs to fight partition, which it called aggression, without mercy. The League promised them, in line with Bludan, assistance in manpower, money, and equipment, should the United Nations endorse partition. Indeed, warned the committee, the Arab states themselves would be forced to take decisive action. The governments explained the committee would be unable to suppress the turbulent passions of their people resulting from the wrong that would be done them by the passage of the partition resolution, and sit still. The fear of the Arab street would figure prominently in the decision-making of most of the Arab regimes as they inched toward the invasion of May 1948. Secretly, the political committee recommended, at Iraq's urging, that a technical committee, immediately renamed the Military Committee, be established by the League to oversee the material assistance to the Palestinians. £1 million were earmarked for the Palestinian Arab struggle. In another secret decision, the committee instructed the League's members to open the gates, to receive children, women, and old people from Palestine, and to support them in the event of disturbances breaking out in Palestine and compelling some of its Arab population to leave the country. The political committee's decisions were then endorsed by the Arabs' heads of state, meeting as the League Council at Ilay in Lebanon in the second week of October. The idea of a mass evacuation from Palestine may already have been doing the rounds among Arab decision-makers more than a year before. Azam reportedly or misreportedly declared in May 1946 that Arab circles proposed to evacuate all Arab women and children from Palestine and send them to neighboring countries to declare jihad and to consider Palestine a war zone. Meanwhile, the military committee, consisting of representatives of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the AHC, began functioning under the chairmanship of Ismail Safwat, an out-of-work Iraqi general described somewhat unfairly by the British ambassador in Baghdad as a typically old-fashioned Turkish officer, extremely brave and unutterably stupid. Safwat submitted a prescient preliminary report to the League Council on the 9th October. He asserted that the Zionists in Palestine were well organized politically, administratively, and militarily, and well armed, and the poorly organized and poorly equipped Palestinians could not withstand them. The 350,000 Arabs living in isolated villages and pockets in the areas earmarked for Jewish sovereignty were facing destruction. He recommended that the Arab states immediately mobilize equipment and train volunteers, deploy forces along Palestine's borders, and He recommended that the Arab states immediately mobilize, equip, and train volunteers, deploy forces along Palestine's borders, and set up a general Arab command that would control all Arab military forces inside and around Palestine, supply the Palestinian Arabs as a first stage with no less than 10,000 rifles and machine guns and grenades, and give the military committee £1 million and provide it with officers and non-commissioned officers who would train the volunteers. He also recommended that the Arab states purchase additional weapons for the forces that would be engaged in Palestine. The Arab states failed to set up a general command to run the prospective war, leaving the supervision of the assistance to the Palestinians in the hands of the military committee. But in line with the committee's recommendations, the League Council secretly resolved that the member states take military measures, meaning mass troops along the frontiers, to mediate and deter the United Nations and the great powers from endorsing partition. During late October-November, the Syrians and Egyptians duly deployed several thousand soldiers near the borders. The Syrian exercises along the Golan in brackets, slightly alarming the British. Indeed, a small Syrian force actually crossed the border near Dan, probably inadvertently, on the 20th of October, and was promptly driven back by British troops without casualties. More significantly, the Council endorsed the Military Committee's recommendations regarding the mobilization and training of volunteers and the equipping of the Palestinians. Registration offices were set up in the Arab states under the auspices of local committees for the defense of Palestine, and a training camp was organized by the Syrian army at Qatana near Damascus. In November, hundreds of volunteers, mainly from Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, arrived. During the following weeks, some of the trainees, organized in platoon and company formations, were sent off to Palestine's towns to bolster local militias. But most of the volunteers were organized as an embryonic army, the Arab Liberation or Salvation Army, Al-Jaysh al-Inqwa, a name apparently coined by Syrian President al-Qawatli, the army's patron and founder, to be commanded by Fawzi al-Qawwaji. Al-Qawwatli was driven, at least partly, by a desire to offset the prospective Hashemite takeover of Palestine, suspected that this would be only a stage in realizing King Abdullah's vision of a greater Syria with Amman as its capital. Egypt and the Saudis, too, were no doubt driven to support al-Qawwaji's appointment and the formation of the ALA from similar anti-Jordanian considerations. The Tripoli-born al-Qawwaji had served as an officer in the Ottoman army, had participated in the Druze revolt against the French Mandate authorities in 1925 to 1927, and in 1936 had led a band of several hundred volunteers, mainly from Iraq and Syria, who assisted the Palestine Arabs in their revolt against the British Mandate. He had well-established anti-imperialist credentials. In 1941, he had resurfaced in Rashid Ali al-Khalani's Iraqi rebellion against the British, and with the rebellion's demise had removed to Berlin, where he had sat out the war serving the Nazis by recruiting Muslim volunteers and broadcasting German propaganda. After the war, he returned to Syria and early in December 1947 was appointed to command the ALA. The appointment was endorsed by the League at its meeting in Cairo in the second week of December, though somewhat contradictorily, probably to appease the Iraqis and Jordanians, the League also designated Safwat commander of the national forces, meaning all the local Arabs and foreign volunteers fighting in Palestine. In effect, al-Kawaji ended up in full command of the ALA, its training and operations, and the local Palestinian Arab commanders, Abdi al-Qadr al-Husseini, Hussein Salami, and others, ended up commanding the various local militias. Safwat was left with a more or less nominal role advising the Arab League on the progress of the war. Haj Amin al-Husseini was forever turning up uninvited at Arab League summit meetings. Through September to November 1947, he had demanded that the League establish a Palestinian government in exile with himself at its head. The League, advised by veteran Palestinian activists, including Izzat Darwaza and Subhi al-Qidra, sometime members of Safwat's military committee, rebuffed him, as it did his demand that his cousin, Abdi al-Qadr al-Husseini, be appointed overall commander of forces in Palestine. Haj Amin had bitterly opposed al-Kawaji's appointment, mindful of 1936, when al-Kawaji had contested his leadership of the revolt. In Berlin, the Mufti had apparently vilified al-Kawaji as a British agent. The two hated each other, and the continuing animosity was significantly to contribute to undermining the Palestinian Arab War effort in 1948. The militia forces raised by and aligned with the Husseinis during the first months of the 1948 war were to operate without coordination with, and often at cross purposes to, the ALA. During the League deliberations of September to October 1947, the Iraqis appear to have been the most militant of the member states, breathing brimstone for home consumption. They called for the Arab states to intervene in Palestine even before the mandate ended. The Egyptians and Saudis led the moderate camp, reluctant to get involved in a war for which they were unready and whose outcome was unpredictable. They also suspected that a Jordanian or Jordanian-Iraqi invasion would be geared to territorial aggrandizement and nothing else. The League took no operational decisions. The UN vote on the 29th of November changed all that. The Arab leaders were now called upon, each by his conscience and his peers, and all by internal opposition factions and the street, to put their money where their mouths were. Already, before the UN vote, Arab politicians had warned that if a satisfactory solution of the Palestine case was not reached, severe measures should be taken against all Jews in Arab countries. On the 24th of November, the head of the Egyptian delegation to the General Assembly, Mohammed Hussein Haikal, said that the lives of 1 million Jews in Muslim countries would be jeopardized by the establishment of a Jewish state. With the passage of the UN resolution, the Arab Street, given its head, spoke unequivocally. There were massive demonstrations in cities across the Middle East and North Africa. In Cairo, there were daily protests, with riffraff quickly joining secondary school students. They vandalized European shops and cafes, but police prevented the mob from storming the Jewish quarter. On the 4th of December, police fired on mobs in Cairo and Mansoura, before the government finally banned all demonstrations. In Damascus, the demonstrators called for jihad and arms. The prime minister promised that the government would comply and be in the forefront of the liberation of Palestine. The Syrian government were Sikh, largely responsible for organizing and directing the demonstrations, making use of agents amongst the teachers, the ulema, the religious authorities, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood, and the leaders of the various city quarters, the British concluded. Damage was done to the American and French legation buildings. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood denounced the UN decision, called for volunteers for Palestine and contributions, and announced that it is a battle either for life or death to a nation of 70 million souls, whom the vilest, the most corrupt, tricky, and destructive people wish to conquer and displace. In some Arab states, the regimes, while issuing inflammatory statements, kept the mobs in check. But where the reins were loosed, or where the police joined the rioters, there was bloody mayhem. In pogroms in British-ruled Aden and Sheikh Othman refugee camp outside the city, 75 Jews were murdered, 78 were wounded, and dozens of homes, shops, and synagogues, and 2 schools were torched during 2nd to 4th of December by Arabs and local Yemeni Levis before British troops restored order. Dozens of Jewish homes and a synagogue were also destroyed or looted. 1 woman was killed, and 67 Jews were injured in rioting on the 2nd of December in Bahrain. In Aleppo, Syria, there was widespread anti-Jewish rioting on the 30th of November and the 1st of December, with dozens of houses, including the town's synagogues and Jewish schools, being torched. It is unclear how many Jews, if any, were injured or killed. 3,000 reportedly fled to Beirut. In Damascus, Jews were set upon, as were nationals of Western states identified with the UN decision. In Egypt, mobs torched the British Institute in Zagazig and attacked the British Consulate General and Anglican Cathedral in Cairo. The Arab governments weighed and responded to the Partition resolution. At the League Political Committee meeting in Cairo in the second week of December, hostilities between the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine had already begun. 5 prime ministers of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan attended. On the table was Safwat's second report of the 27th of November, a thorough analysis of the military situation. Safwat bluntly concluded that a victory over the Jews was not possible by means of armed bands and irregulars alone. Therefore, regular forces must be thrown into the battle, trained and equipped with the best weapons, who will be assisted by Palestinian Arabs bands. Because the Arab states lack sufficient means for a long war everything must be done to assure that the war in Palestine will be over as quickly as possible. The Iraqi delegation, backed by Safwat, proposed that the regular Arab armies intervene to save Palestine, even before the British departed and the Jews proclaimed a state. The Iraqi Prime Minister's aides privately pointed to the street and explained that had the Prime Minister taken a more reasonable line, it was doubtful whether he could have survived for more than 5 minutes. The clear-eyed Prime Minister of Lebanon, Riyad al-Sula, reportedly very depressed, told British diplomats that public opinion in Arab countries was so strong that it would be impossible for any government to prevent volunteers coming to assist the Arabs in Palestine once serious fighting had begun. The Egyptian Foreign Minister, Kashaba Pasha, said the same, but added, perhaps with a touch of humor, that the elements who would volunteer for Palestine were those among whom excitability was greatest, and it was better, for the sake of law and order in Egypt, that they should be out of the country. Al-Husseini, who was left out of the deliberations, was well informed and deeply unhappy with Safwat's proposal for external military intervention. He believed, or at least argued, that Palestine's Arabs could take care of themselves. He feared that such intervention would result in shunting Palestine's Arabs and himself aside and provide an opportunity for land grabs by Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. He was, of course, right. Less hot-headed than other Arab leaders and more reluctant to anger London, the Jordanians favored intervention, principally Jordanian intervention. But only after the British left, the Syrians were rightly suspicious that Jordan intended to annex Palestine or part of it. The other member states demurred, the Saudis and Egyptians leading the opposition, but the Egyptians announced that they themselves lacked the means to intervene. In the end, the Arab League proved unable to agree on a clear goal for the unofficial war or to define a strategy by which it might be won. Fuck. It's what bunch of... Instead, the leaders decided on something more modest. The League vowed, in very general language, to try to stymie the partition plan and prevent the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine, and the member states pledged to give the Palestine Arabs 10,000 rifles, Jordan and Lebanon, thousands each, and Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, 2,000 each rifle to be supplied with 500 bullets, as well as other light weapons. In addition, 3,000 volunteers were to be trained in Syria by the 15th of January 1948. The League promised an additional £1 million for the war effort. British observers commented that although some Arab leaders were eager to avoid conflict, popular feeling was such that they were convinced, probably with considerable justification, that if they accepted a compromise solution, their positions and possibly in some cases their lives would be most insecure. But the prime ministers were also driven by a desire to avoid a clash with the British and by the knowledge that they were not yet prepared for war. The mood of the prime ministers was desperate rather than gasconcading, stated one British intelligence report. Yet the Arab leaders were certain that the Jews would not make do with the area allotted them and were uplifted by the support they were receiving not only from the Muslim world, but from Arab sympathizers and anti-Jews in many countries. The prime ministers agreed to help the Palestine Arabs, but understood that they would not solve the problem on their own. The question in Cairo was not really whether the Arab states would go to war, but when and how. The emergent, vague consensus was that they would have to march when the mandate ended in mid-May 1948. This was implied in Iraqi Foreign Minister Jamali's query to officials in Whitehall. What would be the attitude of HM government if the Arab states sent their armies into Palestine on the termination of the mandate? The assumption would be that the Arab armies would occupy the whole of Palestine, but without molesting the Jews. The Arab get-togethers from Bludan onward had been marked by disunity, mutual suspicion, and cross purposes. Just in case you don't get that, let's read that again. The Arab get-togethers from Bludan onward had been marked by disunity, mutual suspicion, and cross purposes. The character of Arab leadership. Sorry, that's what it is. The antagonisms and suspicions undermined any hope of firm, realistic decision-making in the League councils. At the same time, in order not to appear weak-kneed and hesitant, moderate rulers, such as Abdullah, allowed themselves to be pressed into extremist policies, or at least utterances, lest they be seen as insufficiently zealous. So stupid. All paid lip service to Arab unity and the Palestine Arab cause, and all opposed partition, but all were at a loss about how to prevent it. Most, though they could not admit it to the others, or perhaps to themselves, knew that their armies were weak. Egypt and Jordan's military commanders estimated that the Haganah would prove formidable. Other Arabs may have been more optimistic. One thing was clear, however: there could be no intervention so long as the British were in Palestine. None wished to fight the British, with whom most were aligned and who all understood were too powerful to challenge. Still, having committed themselves to oppose partition, the Arab leaders felt they had to do something. The public bluster, the fear of their own populations, whom they had helped whip up with militant rhetoric into a frenzy, and the pressure of fellow Arab politicians and leaders all combined to egg them on. The Arab states had embarked on a course leading to war. What remained to be seen was who exactly would take part and how it would all end. The British response to the UN resolution was formulated at the cabinet meeting on the 4th of December 1947 on the basis of a joint memorandum submitted by the Foreign and Colonial Secretaries. Whitehall had begun to plan the withdrawal, a vast logistical and political enterprise, given the 100,000 Britons in the mandate's military forces and civilian bureaucracies, and the more than 250,000 tons of stores and ammunition, and 14,000 vehicles. Soon after Bevan's withdrawal announcement of February 1947, Britain had been impoverished by the World War, indeed by the two World Wars, and a pullout had become an economic as well as political and ethical imperative. Maintaining the army and police in Palestine had cost the Labour government more than £200 million in the 18 months after it assumed office. Starting in June 1947, military manpower in Palestine was gradually reduced. the numbers declining from 78,000 to 55,000 by the 1st of December. The rest would gradually withdraw during the following months. The planning and pace of the withdrawal needs to be viewed against the dual backdrop of developments in Palestine and the international arena. Bevan regarded the UNSCOP majority report of the 1st of September 1947 as unjust and immoral. He promptly decided that Britain would not attempt to impose it on the Arabs. Indeed, he expected them to resist its implementation. The publication of the report significantly invigorated British planning for the withdrawal. The army argued that it would need a minimum of 18 months. But the international political momentum was inexorable, and in October, the British authorities began hurriedly to plan the wind down of the mandate. The UN Partition resolution had stipulated the 1st of August 1948 as the deadline for both the termination of the mandate and the completion of the military withdrawal. The British cabinet went one better. In the meeting on the 4th of December 1947, it resolved that the mandate would end on the 15th of May and the withdrawal would be completed by the 1st of August. But the cabinet decision added a fatal twist to its apparent conformity to international will. It decided, in a sop to the Arabs, to refrain from aiding the enforcement of the UN resolution, meaning the partition of Palestine, and in an important secret corollary, in line with the recommendation of the Foreign and Colonial Secretaries, it agreed that Britain would do all in its power to delay until early May the arrival in Palestine of the UN Implementation Commission. The Foreign Office immediately informed the Commission that it would be intolerable for the Commission to begin to exercise its authority while the mandate Palestine government was still administratively responsible for Palestine. Britain asked, in effect, it was an order that the Commission delay its arrival until May 1st. This sealed the Commission's fate and nullified any possibility of an orderly implementation of the partition resolution. Though an advance party of the Commission arrived in Palestine at the start of March 1948, the Commission itself never reached the country or functioned. British hostility, Arab boycott, and the descent of the country into full-scale civil war assured that the partition resolution would not be implemented and that the Commission would be redundant. The advance party, headed by Spanish diplomat Pablo de Azcárate, was effectively isolated in the house in the British-guarded Secretary Zone near the King David Hotel, with its 2 secretaries forced to do the cooking and cleaning. The British made their stay as uncomfortable as possible. The Jewish Agency liaison officers to the Commission, Walter Eiten, reported that the poor man, Azcárate, simply did not know where to turn. Azcárate spent the following weeks meeting with British and Jewish officials. Arabs refused to see him, but to no purpose. On the 14th of May, with the conditions on the ground radically transformed, the Commission was formally disbanded by the General Assembly. Azcárate had spent most of late April and early May trying to assist the UN Consular Truce Commission appointed by the UN Secretary-Consul on the 23rd April to achieve a ceasefire. The Truce Commission proved as effective as the Implementation Commission.